in the summer of 1540, a 24-year-old princess stood before a tribunal of strange men and did something almost unthinkable. To save her own life, she enthusiastically agreed, on the record, in writing, that her husband found her body so repulsive he couldn't bring himself to touch her. Most people remember Anne of Cleves as the lucky wife, the plain one, the one who got away. But the real story is far darker, and the infamous insult that defined her for 5 centuries hides the biggest lie of all. Anne was born on September 22, 1515, in Düsseldorf in the small German Duchy of Cleves. Her father was Duke John III, a cautious, moderate man. Her mother, Maria of Jülichburg, was strict, devout, and utterly allergic to frivolity. And that mattered, because Maria controlled every detail of her daughter's education. Anne was taught needlework, household management, prayer, and that was essentially it. No French, no Latin, no English, no music. In her homeland, a noblewoman who played instruments was considered slightly scandalous. No dancing, no card games, no courtly flirtation. Anne of Cleves was raised to be modest, useful, and quiet. She was being shaped into the perfect German duchess. Unfortunately, fate was about to ship her to the one court in Europe where those exact virtues would be treated as defects. There was one other detail from her childhood, a small one, easy to miss. In 1527, when Anne was 11, her father signed a betrothal agreement, promising her to Francis, the 9-year-old heir of the Duke of Lorraine. It was a paper arrangement between 2 children who never met, and it was quietly cancelled a few years later. A scrap of abandoned diplomatic paperwork filed away and forgotten. 13 years later, that forgotten scrap would become the most valuable document of Anne's entire life. Because in 1539, the most dangerous marriage market in Europe opened for business. Henry VIII of England needed a 4th wife. And his track record was, to put it mildly, horrifying. Wife number 1, Catherine of Aragon, cast aside and left to die in isolation. Wife number 2, Anne Boleyn, beheaded on charges most historians consider fabricated. Wife number 3, Jane Seymour, dead 12 days after giving Henry his longed-for son. By 1539, Henry was 48 years old, morbidly obese, and nursing a festering ulcer on his leg that oozed pus and reportedly could be smelled from a room away. He was irritable, paranoid, and in constant pain. The eligible princesses of Europe were not exactly lining up. One famously joked that she would marry Henry only if she had 2 heads. But Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the ruthless architect of the entire Tudor political machine, had a plan. England needed Protestant allies against France and Spain. Cleves fit perfectly. And Cleves had 2 unmarried sisters. Cromwell pushed the match with everything he had. It would prove to be the worst decision of his life. First, though, Henry wanted to see the merchandise. He dispatched his court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the greatest portrait artists who ever lived, to Germany in August 1539 to paint the 23-year-old Anne. Holbein, by most accounts, painted her honestly. A calm, pleasant-faced young woman in rich German dress, gazing serenely out of the frame. Henry took one look and fell in love, not with Anne, with the painting. He began building a fantasy of the perfect bride, a romance conjured entirely inside his own head, starring a woman he had never met. Anyone who has ever fallen for a profile picture knows exactly where this is going. Anne crossed to England in the dead of winter, landing on December 27, 1539, after a grueling journey. She spoke no English. She knew nothing of English customs, English fashion, or the English king's obsession with chivalric games. Which brings this story to New Year's Day 1540, and one of the most catastrophic first dates in recorded history. Henry, drunk on his own fantasy, decided to surprise his bride at Rochester. He and a handful of gentlemen disguised themselves in matching cloaks and burst unannounced into Anne's chamber. In Henry's imagination, this was pure storybook romance. The maiden's heart would recognize her true king through any disguise, and she would fall into his arms. Instead, a hulking, sweating, middle-aged stranger she had never seen before barged into her room and tried to embrace and kiss her. Anne reacted the way any sensible woman would. She recoiled, gave him a cold look, and turned back to the window where a bull baiting was underway in the courtyard. She had no idea who he was. She was ignoring the King of England to watch dogs fight a bull. Witnesses said the humiliation on Henry's face was visible across the room. He stormed out, and by the time he reached his advisors, the fantasy was dead. He told Cromwell bluntly, "I like her not." Anne had committed no crime except failing to recognize a stranger. But Henry's colossal ego had been wounded, and men had lost their heads over far less. Here's the staggering part. Henry spent the next 5 days desperately trying to escape the marriage, and couldn't. The alliance was signed. Rejecting Anne now would insult Cleves, alienate the German princes, and leave England isolated against France and Spain. On January 6, 1540, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Henry VIII grimly married a woman he had already decided to despise. On his way to the ceremony, he reportedly grumbled that if it weren't for politics, he would never do this thing. It was a wedding with all the warmth of a hostage exchange, and for Anne the hostage part was about to become literal. The wedding night was a disaster, though only one side of the story survives, because only one side was allowed to talk. Henry emerged the next morning and announced to Cromwell that he liked his bride even less than before. Then he did something genuinely jaw-dropping. He began describing his new wife's naked body to his ministers. He complained about the slackness of her flesh. He declared, in clinical detail, that he had been so repelled he could not consummate the marriage. And, crucially, he insisted the failure was entirely her body's fault, not his. A 48-year-old man who could barely walk, whose rotting leg could clear a corridor, stood before his court and announced that a healthy 24-year-old woman was too disgusting to touch. And every man in the room nodded along. because disagreeing with Henry VIII was a career-ending move, sometimes a life-ending one. What followed was 6 months of slow, grinding public humiliation. The couple shared a bed regularly, and every morning became a bizarre ritual. Doctors and courtiers interrogating the king about his performance, and the king loudly insisting that Anne remained exactly as untouched as the day she arrived. The entire court knew. The ambassadors knew. The laundresses knew. Meanwhile, Anne, raised in a household where such matters were never discussed, reportedly told her ladies-in-waiting that the king kissed her goodnight and bade her farewell each morning, and asked, puzzled, whether that wasn't enough. Her ladies, stunned, had to explain that it was not. Whether that famous exchange reflected genuine innocence or something far more calculated is a question that will return before this story ends. Because while Anne was navigating her strange half-marriage, the ground beneath her was cracking. Henry had noticed someone new. Catherine Howard, a vivacious teenager serving in Anne's own household. And when Henry VIII wanted a new wife, someone always paid the price. The machinery moved with terrifying speed. On June 10, 1540, Thomas Cromwell, the most powerful minister in England, the man who had built the Cleves marriage, was arrested at the council table for treason and heresy, stripped of his medals, and dragged to the Tower. His enemies had convinced Henry that the disastrous marriage was Cromwell's fault, and Henry was happy to agree. 2 weeks later, on June 24th, Anne received an abrupt order: leave court immediately and move to Richmond Palace. The official explanation was her health. Anne wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what had happened to the last queen who was sent away from court. Anne Boleyn had been banished, then arrested, then tried, then beheaded, all in under 3 weeks. Alone in a foreign country, unable to speak the language fluently, with no allies and no army, Anne of Cleves spent those days at Richmond waiting to find out if she would live. On July 6, 1540, a delegation of the King's commissioners arrived at Richmond Palace. According to reports, when Anne understood that the King's men had come for her, she collapsed, fainting dead away, apparently convinced they had come to take her to the Tower. What they actually brought was stranger, an offer. Henry wanted the marriage annulled on 2 grounds. First, that old scrap of paperwork, the cancelled childhood betrothal to Francis of Lorraine, now dusted off and weaponized as evidence that Anne had never been free to marry at all. Second, non-consummation, which required Anne to publicly confirm the most degrading claim imaginable: that her husband had found her too repulsive to touch, and that she remained a virgin after 6 months of marriage. Catherine of Aragon had faced a similar demand years earlier and refused. She fought for her title until it destroyed her. Anne Boleyn had fought too, and her grave was unmarked. Anne of Cleves looked at the paperwork that would brand her a humiliated reject in front of all of Europe, and she read the room perfectly. She agreed, immediately, completely, almost cheerfully. She confirmed everything. She signed everything. She wrote to Henry submitting herself entirely to his judgment, referring to him as her sovereign and, soon, her brother. On July 9, 1540, the marriage was declared null and void. Anne had given the tyrant the one thing no wife had ever given him: total, frictionless surrender. And Henry, a man whose cruelty was always sharpest when he felt defied, suddenly had no one to punish. Deprived of resistance, he became bizarrely, extravagantly generous. Anne received an income of roughly £3,000 a year, millions in today's money. She received Richmond Palace and Bletchingley Manor. She received, in one of history's darkest real estate ironies, Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, the beheaded queen whose fate she had dodged. She was granted the official title of the king's beloved sister, with precedence over every woman in England except the new queen and Henry's own daughters. There was only one condition, unwritten but absolute. She could never leave England. The pension, the palaces, the title, all of it was a gilded leash. Anne of Cleves was now the wealthiest hostage in Europe. 19 days later, the bill for the marriage came due, just not for her. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill by a reportedly clumsy executioner who needed multiple strokes. And on that exact same day, with breathtaking tact, Henry married the teenaged Catherine Howard. The minister who arranged the wedding lost his head over it. The bride who endured it got a castle. History rarely writes its own punchlines this cleanly. Then Anne did something that still astonishes historians. She went back. That New Year's, she returned to court, presented lavish gifts, and knelt gracefully before Catherine Howard, the girl from her own household who had replaced her. The two women dined with the king, and after Henry retired for the evening, Anne and Catherine danced together. Anne laughed, drank the king's wine, and played the role of the cheerful beloved sister flawlessly. Some observers noted she seemed happier than she'd ever been as queen, and honestly, who could blame her? Her performance was so convincing that in late 1541, dangerous rumours swept London that Anne had secretly given birth to Henry's son, and the king was about to take her back. The Privy Council launched a terrifying investigation, and 2 gossiping women were thrown in the Tower over it. The rumour was entirely false, but the fact that the Crown treated idle chatter about Anne as a state emergency shows how precarious her safety still was. She was living well. She was also living carefully, because the Tudor court was about to demonstrate once again exactly what happened to queens who didn't. In February 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded. The vibrant teenager Henry had discarded Anne to marry was executed for adultery, the very crime Henry's paranoia had always feared after barely 18 months on the throne. She was around 18 years old. Anne had escaped the trap. Her replacement had walked straight into it. Whispers circulated that Henry might now remarry his beloved sister, and Anne's own brother pushed for it through diplomatic channels. Henry chose the twice-widowed Catherine Parr instead, Anne, by all appearances, took the rejection with remarkable composure. Surviving Henry VIII once was luck. Volunteering for a second round would have been madness. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally died, bloated, immobile, and rotting from the leg up. Anne had outlasted the tyrant. And this is where the schoolbook version rolls the credits. The clever wife, rich and free, living happily ever after. The reality was crueler. The moment Henry died, Anne's protection died with him. To the new regime of the boy King Edward VI, she was not the beloved sister. She was a line item. An expensive foreign woman with no function, draining the treasury. Her settlement was aggressively rolled back. Richmond Palace and Bletchingley were taken from her, swapped for lesser estates. Her income shrank while prices soared, and she slid, year by year, into genuine debt. So Anne wrote to the one person on earth obligated to help her, her brother Wilhelm, Duke of Cleves. She begged him to negotiate her return home. Wilhelm, who had used his sister as a diplomatic pawn to begin with, refused. Bringing her home meant political complications, and worse, paying her bills. Her letters went effectively unanswered. The woman who had survived Henry VIII discovered that her own blood had abandoned her. There was no going home. There was never going to be a going home. She endured. When Mary of Us claimed the throne in 1553, Anne rode in the coronation procession directly behind the new queen, sharing a chariot with the future Elizabeth I, still, on paper, one of the highest-ranking women in England. But even that turned poisonous. When Wyatt's rebellion erupted in 1554, Anne's friendly ties to Elizabeth briefly put her under suspicion of conspiracy, and the warmth of the new regime cooled. Foreign, aging, indebted, and quietly watched, she withdrew from public life almost entirely. Anne of Cleves died on July 16, 1557, at Chelsea Manor at just 41 years old, most likely of cancer, though the record isn't certain. She had outlived Henry, Cromwell, Catherine, Howard, and every scheme built to break her. And in death, she claimed a prize none of Henry's other wives ever touched. On August 3, 1557, Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey with full royal honours, the only one of the 6 wives to rest there. Anne Boleyn, the dazzling queen who fought for her crown, lies in an unmarked plot by the tower where she was butchered. Catherine of Aragon lies in a provincial cathedral. But the discarded foreign reject, the wife branded too repulsive to touch, sleeps among the kings and queens of England to this day. Which leaves one last piece of the story. The insult. Everyone knows it. Henry VIII took one look at Anne of Cleves and called her a Flanders mare. The horse-faced bride, the ugly wife, the punchline of the 6 wives rhyme. It is the single most famous thing about her, the label that has defined her for 5 centuries. And Henry never said it. Not at Rochester, not at the wedding, not anywhere. No contemporary source, no letter, no ambassador's report, no court record contains the phrase. It was invented in 1679 by Bishop Gilbert Burnet, a historian writing more than 130 years after Anne was dead, who put the insult in Henry's mouth to spice up his account. Henry's real recorded complaints were cold and bureaucratic. That he liked her not, that her body displeased him. It took a later century to turn a living woman into livestock. The cruelest humiliation of Anne's life wasn't inflicted by her husband. It was inflicted on her corpse by a man she never met, and the world has been repeating it ever since. Modern research has finally begun tearing the caricature down. Historian Heather Darcy's 2019 study of long-ignored German archives revealed a woman who was highly literate, politically connected, and a shrewd manager of her own vast English estates, which casts that famous bedroom, Innocence, in a very different light. Some historians now suspect that Anne's wide-eyed naivety was a brilliant, calculated performance, keeping her blameless while handing Henry his exit. We'll likely never know the truth. But consider the final scoreboard. The genius minister lost his head. The pretty teenager lost hers. The tyrant rotted to death in his own bed. And the stupid, ugly German girl died in royal honor and lies in Westminster Abbey, remembered by a lie, buried like a queen. Thanks for watching channel. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.